Hi, everybody. This is our second week of multilingual nonfiction writing. Um, my name is Samantha Steiner. If anyone wasn't able to join us for the first meeting, you're welcome to go back and look over it. But if you don't have time or interest, or you're excited about this particular lesson, you can dive right on in. You're not going to be missing anything major, or at least not anything majorly necessary to understand this lesson. So this week, we're going to talk about familiar languages. This is a term that I invented, so it's really just for the purposes of this class. But a familiar language in this case is one that we feel that we as a writer know, but that our readers might not necessarily know. So this gives us a particular kind of power and privilege where we have access to information. We are delivering that information or sharing that information with our readers. Um, of course, there's always the question of what gets lost in translation, or more creatively, what gets made or hybridized in translation, what gets invented in the process of translation, or in sharing. So, how can we share a language that we feel we know well that our readers might not? I think the first step is to acknowledge the limitations of how well we know that language. And so while in my case, I grew up with a babysitter who spoke almost exclusively to me in Spanish, and parents who spoke almost exclusively to me in English. And so I feel that very familiar with the language of Spanish, and particularly Argentine Spanish, because that's where my babysitter was from. I don't feel comfortable claiming to represent all Argentine people or all Latinx people, because biologically I'm not, um, and culturally I'm not. So that I want to acknowledge my familiarity, but I want to acknowledge the limits to my familiarity. Um, and so I think the wonderful gift that we have in nonfiction writing is that we are responsible for reporting our experiences, and those experiences can be um, imagined, they can be fantasy as well, but that we're not really responsible for trying to depict an entire culture in our writing. And I think we can make it clear that we're not attempting to do that. Um, and so for me, a language that I don't feel as comfortable trying to represent actually is Hebrew. Even though my family background is Jewish, I grew up what I call Seinfeld Jewish, which is all of the complaining and none of the Hebrew. And so while I heard Hebrew being spoken or chanted on religious holidays, I didn't ever feel the level of familiarity where I would tell anybody I can speak or I can understand Hebrew. However, Hebrew is still an important part of my life, right? Almost as a set piece, but more than that, as a symbol, as an object of meaning. And so I feel that if I were to write about Hebrew, while I probably couldn't translate most of the words, I could talk about the sound of the language, or I could talk about trying to speak it and how the language feels in my throat and in my nose, how the language lives in the body. I feel that's a really exciting exercise, because it's not even claiming to attempt a translation, right? That idea is out the window. We're generating something entirely new, and maybe something more useful to the reader, maybe something more accessible. So with that in mind, we are going to attempt to share screen here, and I'm going to show everybody a reading by the author Joy Castro, which includes both English and Spanish. She's a wonderful author. I encourage everyone to read her beyond this piece, but let's see what we can do here. Okay. A reading by the author.
Sometimes when I start to write, my goal in writing this piece was to compose a post-colonial eco-feminist piece in 3 pages or less. So that community know is who Chocmool is. So you may know that Chocmool is an intercessory deity who traveled throughout Mesoamerica and sees statues of Chocmool. He lies on his back, holding a stone bowl on his belly, and he
Oh no, I think we're having some technical difficulties here. Let me make sure. Oh, here we go. Okay. I apologize for that. Let's go theater mode. I think that will work a little better. I'm going to start from the beginning just in case we missed something.
I like to set myself sometimes when I start to write. My goal in writing this piece was to compose a
difficulties here.
post-colonial gay feminist piece in 3 pages or less.
I
So that was the
apologize
goal.
for that. Let's go theater mode.
And I think the only thing you need to know
I'm
is
going to start from the beginning just in case.
Chocmol is. Some of you may know that Chocmol is an intercessory deity. If you travel throughout Mesoamerica, you will see statues of Chocmol. He lies on his back, holding a stone bowl on his belly, and he looks out at you, and he has this peculiar grin. And the grin is because what goes in the bowl is the still beating heart of the human sacrificial victim. So the idea is that you sacrifice the person, the bloody heart there, and the moisture of the blood induces the rain god Twala to let the rain fall. So it's like this circle of moisture. Okay, so that's all you need to know. That's who Chocmol is. Okay. And so this is called No Mas Monkey. And the epigraph is from Bernal Diaz del Castillo, The Conquest of New Spain. This is an eyewitness account of the conquest of Mexico. And the epigraph goes, and some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. No Mas Monkey. I thanked you, but didn't really like the earrings you made. Their dangling glass sea beads of light into a bracelet cheap. Their strange geometry ugly to me. Drunk, I didn't know how to feel your soft grip on me, softer than a man's. In on your scheme, our boyfriends stayed away, buying beer forever, while you tried a thing you'd only seen in Jack's magazines. I moved in your musk like a boat down the highway, to be polite, to be my hood. I like my makeup, you said, when people suggested that you tone it down. Your glossy balloon lips, your cold red eyes, your brown cheerleader's body cased in leopard spandex, the fake leopard rearing. In the Thunderbird apartments we lived together, you, me, your boyfriend, mine, all feral, all under 20. You read Pet Cemetery and believed in demons, crows as omens, put undead as the church. I went to college and believed in nothing. We folded our laundry together in the comfort of cloth, soft and warm, clean, the lemon pink scent of mimosa trees glowing and sweet, San Antonio string. But you were hard, a runaway like me. When we watched The Fly on cable TV, and the telepod failed, twisting the baboon's insides out to its skin, you said flatly, "You must be." Hysterical, stoned, we couldn't stop saying it. Later, you had a daughter and got fat. Jack sold cocaine and left. When I visited, you had a new guy, nice, who didn't smack you. Our kids played while you talked about how much your furniture cost, how you found dressers dumped on the curb, cleaned them, painted over their pasts. You said we'd always be friends. I understand. I was in grad school then. In Mexico City with other professors, I stopped, shocked, at the glass case in the Museum of Anthropology that held earrings just like the ones you made me. The ancient Aztecs, dug up at the seeds of your empires, made an empire you never saw. Same shape, same size, same design. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, breathing hard as if I'd been running for hurt. I wanted to show you the scale model of Tenochtitlan, the blue water, the bridges, the islands, the aqueducts, the intricately engineered causeways where 10 horses could trot side by side, the thousands of canoes, the glory Europeans couldn't fathom, the lake they drained, the temples they buried. But you were dead, smashed by 4 teenagers taking a red light at 80 in an SUV. Houston, R.I.P. Only the world tree links us now, its roots with you, its trunk with me, its branches in the heavens, where gods require blood sacrifice and prayer and speak a language we can't understand. Here's my heart. I didn't know how to see what you gave me, Cindy, how to wear what you put to adorn me with. They've lain in a drawer, these thin fingers, quietly in the dark. When I open it, they flash like water.
Okay, that was incredibly moving. I've read it and heard it multiple times before, but it still gets me. So let's talk about this. The title of the story is No Mas Monkey, and that is the only line that appears in Spanish, outside of the one reference to Chacmul, whom Joy Castro explains the significance of, right? That Chacmul is a god who makes it rain when given a blood sacrifice. And so the offering of moisture from the body provokes moisture from the skies. This line, No Mas Monkey, starts out as a joke between friends. Joy Castro never translates it. But I find that she doesn't need to, right? That we can count on the reader having a good enough knowledge of Spanish to understand that mas means more, and also to read from context, right? What just happened. And so when this notion is brought back in the title, and the idea of this brought back towards the end of the piece, all of a sudden, No Mas Monkey takes on a new meaning, that this is a laughter that is gone, that it is actually no mas. And so the choice of what line is used in Spanish is really important because it's operating in two levels, right? That it's firstly a joke, and secondly, an absence, that it's actually no mas. Another aspect of the story is the treatment of culture, Mexican culture and Aztec culture. That at the beginning of the story, Joy Castro acknowledges that she didn't like the earrings that the person she describes made for her. That their design seemed, I think, too gaudy for her. And so I really love that she's willing to own her ambivalence towards this culture, even as she's honoring it, right? That she's starting from a place of honesty, that as a reader, I feel I can trust her because she's not giving me a sales pitch. And so I would recommend actually the book Audition by Michael Shurtleff. It was recommended to me by the Sarah Lawrence professor Jake Slichter. It's actually a book on how actors can portray great characters in their auditions, but it's so helpful for any writer. And one of the principles Michael Shurtleff discusses in this book is opposites. That for whatever is true about a character, the opposite should also be true. And so I think Joy Castro does a wonderful job with this in the language, that for all of her familiarity with English, there's a familiarity with Spanish. And for all of her affection and longing and grieving for her friend, there's also annoyance or impatience, right? That there's that scene in which her friend says that they'll be friends forever, and the narrator of the story says, just smiles and says, "I was in grad school then." And so I love that she's willing to own these aspects of herself. Um, so that's No Mas Monkey. I think it's a great example to go to for how a piece can work two cultures together with relatively little sampling. Right? There's not a huge learning curve. And it's great that at the beginning of her talk, she explained what Chacmul was. But for me, before I even knew, um, when I read this piece, I felt the enormity of that line, even if I didn't know exactly what it meant. And I think it's up to every author how much they want to give their reader. Um, I feel that it can be summarized as drawing a circle. This is a metaphor that was actually taught to me by Joanne Beard, another Sarah Lawrence professor. But the idea is to draw a circle for the reader, and you want to draw just enough of the circle that the reader's brain can autofill the rest of it. Not so little that the reader can't tell it's going to be a circle. But if the work is too pre-digested, it's boring. We want a treasure hunt. We want a puzzle to put together. The brain likes having some exercise. Um, and so if we deliver every phrase and every translation for that phrase and every explanation, then it just becomes kind of exhausting. It's spoon feeding. And so for myself, I feel when in doubt, I'd rather err towards under explaining. I'd rather be really clear about the emotional meaning of the piece. But for the technical details, for the logic of it, readers are able to make leaps that we wouldn't expect them to be able to make. And so for Joy Castro, I think the lesson there is that we can be honest with ourselves. We can own our ambivalences, and we can still honor the people and the languages and the cultures that have influenced our lives in a really wonderful way. So that is Joy Castro. Now we are going to delve into another author whom I am totally enamored with. Let's not hide it. This is Ruth Ozeki. And so we're going to do another round of screen sharing, this time with the text, and I'll read it out loud as we go through it. Okay, this is from Ruth Ozeki's novel, A Tale for the Time Being. This is told from the point of view of a young woman named Nao who lives in Japan. She's a high schooler. Okay. Oh, this is from her diary, I should add. Okay. So now I really am going to tell you about the fascinating life of Yasutani Jiko, the famous anarchist feminist novelist turned Buddhist nun of the Taisho era. But first, I need to explain about this book you're holding. We'll notice that Ozeki uses footnotes. So 22, a stout, compact tome, perhaps a crown octavo, right? We're sampling a little Italian here, measuring approximately 5 by 7.5 inches. Again, the choice to use inches over the metric system. We've got a sort of linguistic blending happening. You've probably noticed that it doesn't look like an ordinary schoolgirl's pure diary with puffy marshmallow animals on a shiny pink cover and a heart-shaped lock and a little golden key. And when you first picked it up, you probably didn't think, oh, here's a nice pure diary written by an interesting Japanese schoolgirl. Gee, I think I'll read that. Because when you picked it up, you thought it was a philosophical masterpiece called À la recherche du temps perdu by the famous French author named Marcel Proust, and not an insignificant diary by a nobody named Nao Yasutani. So it just goes to show that it's true what they say. You can't tell a book by its cover. Cover is worn, made of reddish cloth. Title is embossed in tarnished gold letters on the front and again on the spine. And so we notice there's a continuation. The footnotes are not just translating linguistic terms, they're providing context for the diary for actually what we can't see and hold with our eyes. So this is a really fun play of like what language belongs where. And again, like this linguistic blending, right, that we've got English translation of what is presumably first written in Japanese, and that it's written in a book that has been, the cover is by Proust, it's in French, and then again, that sprinkling of Italian and in inches rather than the metric system. So I think Ozeki is creating this really fun, wacky place where pretty much anything goes. They say that any book or any piece of writing has its own kind of cartoon physics to it. And so as long as those rules, whatever they are, remain consistent throughout the book, that the author doesn't break the reader's trust by changing the terms on them unexpectedly or in a way that they're not prepared to handle, anything goes. I think that's incredibly fun. Okay, so you can't tell a book by its cover. I hope you're not too disappointed. What happened is that Marcel Proust's book got hacked, only I didn't do it. I bought it this way, pre-hacked, at a little handicraft boutique over in Harajuku. And Harajuku? And then they actually give the characters in Japanese, an area in Tokyo famous for both for youth culture and street fashion. Okay. Where they sell one-of-a-kind DIY goods like crochet scarves and keitai pouches. Notice there's no translation for that. And beaded cuffs and other cool stuff. Handicraft is a super big fad in Japan, and everyone is knitting and beading and crocheting and making pepakura. Pepakura? Right here we have the pronunciative Spanish or the English transliteration, and then the characters. Paper crafts from the English paper plus craft. And I think it's really fun to notice how things are being translated. I imagine that if you went to a dictionary and looked up Harajuku, this is probably not exactly what would come up. That Harajuku is probably famous or known for other things. But that this is the part of it that's important to the story. We're getting just what we need for the story. And again, for paper crafts, it means something else to have the word there in Japanese than to just have now our narrators say paper crafts. I should add this piece is a work of fiction, while Joy Castro's was nonfiction. I think we can take lessons from every genre. So that is why I chose this. Okay. So a little handicraft boutique over in Harajuku where they sell one-of-a-kind DIY goods like crochet scarves and keitai pouches and beaded cuffs and other cool stuff. Handicraft is a super big fad in Japan, and everyone is knitting and beading and crocheting and making pepakura. But I'm quite clumsy, so I have to buy my DIY goods if I want to keep up with the trend. The girl who makes these diaries is a super famous crafter who buys container loads of old books from all over the world and then neatly cuts out all the printed pages and puts in blank paper instead. She does it so authentically, you don't even notice the hack, and you almost think that the letters just slipped off the pages and fell to the floor like a pile of dead ants. Okay, so what just happened here? Metaphorically, the narrator took a book by Marcel Proust and wiped all of the language out of it. Rather, the person she describes did this. So she's actually telling us both in her choices in translation and with the content of the story that this is a book about wiping language off a page or translating language or basically throwing away the rule book and often hacking up the rule book and replacing it with a different set of rules. I think this is fantastic, right? That French, the whole French language gets wiped away like a pile of dead ants. And I think this can be done with the language of French because historically it's been so associated with fixtures of power. But I want to remind everyone to bear in mind that not all languages are rooted equally in the human consciousness and in global power dynamics. And so I would be really skittish or really wary about writing something about this about a language that was not so historically associated with power. There's the idea of punching upwards, right? Picking on people who are able to defend themselves. But I would not want to do this with a language that historically has been associated with marginalization or oppression. And so I think this is really fun upending of the power dynamics rather than reinforcing dynamics that might already be there. All right, let's keep going. Recently, some nasty stuff has been happening in my life. And the day I bought the diary, I was skipping school and feeling especially blue. So I decided to go shopping in Harajuku to cheer myself up. When I saw these old books on the shelf, I thought they were a shop display, so I didn't pay any attention to them. But when the salesgirl pointed out the hack to me, of course I had to have one immediately. And they weren't cheap either, but I loved the worn feeling of the cover, and I could tell it would feel so good to write inside like a real published book. Best of all, I knew it would be an excellent security feature. Let's talk a little bit about time. So at the beginning of this novel, the narrator now points out that her name sounds a lot like the word now, like in the present. That she is writing this book, and for her, what is the present will, in the future, when that book is read, will be the past. And so here we have Proust, whose book is not just associated with French, but historic French. And so while the cover is very old, the pages inside are so new they don't even have ink on them. And again, that what now assumed was a shop display turned out to be a product, which he thought was probably very, very old, turned out to have sort of a newness contained within it. And so I think we can make all kinds of connections to this about like what is canonical literature, what is literature associated with power, and how can we work our way inside of the canon, right? How can we hack out the book and replace it with something more exciting? Or just exciting to this era, relevant to this era. How can we innovate? Okay. I don't know if you've ever had this problem of people baiting you up and stealing things from you and using them against you. But if you have, then you'll understand that this book was total genius in case one of my stupid classmates decided to casually pick up my diary and read it and post it to the internet or something. Well, now we have really modern the internet. But who would pick up an old book called À la recherche du temps perdu, right? My stupid classmates would just think it was homework for Juku. And Juku? Cram school. They wouldn't even know what it meant. Actually, I didn't know what it meant either, since my ability to speak French is non-existent. Isn't this such an exciting little revelation? How many liberties now the narrator is taking with this book. She's admitting she's coming from a place of almost no knowledge, right? Her ability to speak French is non-existent, but she's doing it anyway. There were a bunch of books with different titles for sale. Some of them were in English, like Great Expectations and Gulliver's Travels, which were okay. Wow, right? That again, these are bold, bold moves, right? And English has been so strongly affiliated with power that this is upending dynamics, right? That have been oppressive historically. And so to say Great Expectations and Gulliver's Travel, they were okay. But I thought it would be better to buy a title I couldn't read, since knowing the meaning might possibly interfere with my own creative expression. I love this sentence so much. Let's read it one more time. There were a bunch of books with different titles for sale. Some of them were in English, like Great Expectations and Gulliver's Travels, which were okay, but I thought it would be better to buy a title I couldn't read, since knowing the meaning might possibly interfere with my own creative expression. There were others in different languages too, like German and Russian and even Chinese, but I ended up choosing À la recherche du temps perdu because I figured it was probably French, and French is cool and has a sophisticated feeling. And besides, this book is exactly the right size to fit into my handbag. Okay, let's open up this last section. So there were so many choices of which languages a book could be in. And let's notice how many times this title is being repeated, not in English, but in French. This is the only French that appears in this whole section. It's just the title of the book, right? And what does the title mean? We know enough to recognize the word time, right? And so this is like a return to things past. I'm not sure that's the literal translation. Let's take a quick look. In search of lost time. What better choice, right? What better choice for this passage to be about? In search of lost time, because we are bouncing around time and bouncing around language, right? Which of course changes over time. And then again, like, let's look at this. French is cool and has a sophisticated feeling. I think this is so speaking from the narrator's perspective as a young woman, um, right? That there's a certain naivety to the tone, but also I feel these are the things that maybe we think um, subconsciously, or the kind of connotative meanings or associations we carry about languages that we almost never voice out loud, right? Like, this language is cool, this language feels sophisticated. I think it's really fun to write into the problem rather than avoid the problem, right? To say, well, I don't want to come off as snobby because I'm using French, but actually let's lean into it. Let's say, I want to be snobby, I want to be cool. Let's take the ideas around this language and use them to feed the story. So we're going to stop share here. You all get to look at my face. Lucky you. Okay, so now we've had a little bit of Castro, we've had a little bit of Ozeki. um, let's talk about the problem of our audience, or the question of our audience. I feel for myself, on a first draft, I'm not even thinking about audience. And I encourage anybody, if worrying about whom we're writing to or whom we're writing for is something that's stressful, don't think about it. Don't worry about it. That can happen later. I think the more important thing is to just get writing. But once we do get writing, or if this is a question that we feel like we need to answer in order to get writing, um, I think it's really important to think about audience. For one thing, if we're representing a language that our audience likely doesn't know, it's also likely that the power dynamics are such that the whatever language we're using in our writing has historically been marginalized, or made somehow inferior by English, um, or made to seem inferior relative to English. And so this is a rule I use for myself. Whatever languages I choose to use, I consult people who are native speakers, and not just one person. I try to consult multiple people, to ask them to read my writing and give me feedback so that I can learn about myself. And it's inevitable that with this process, we'll discover our own biases, and privileges, and maybe things that we don't like about ourselves. But if we don't do it, then we're putting out work that could be promoting really harmful ideas. And so my feeling is, if you are able to get a sensitivity reader or sensitivity readers, great. If you're able to pay them or compensate them for their work, which is so worthwhile, and is not just a form of intellectual labor, but also emotional labor, for the honesty that it takes, I also strongly encourage that. And then again, a rule I set for myself is that I want to write so that I would never feel embarrassed, to show my depiction of this language to a native speaker, or someone who's associated with the culture, affiliated with this language. So I feel my writing is, I hope, for everybody. Um, but the real test for me of how it passes muster is the people whom I'm representing. Um, how do they feel about that representation or that depiction? And so in this way, I think language is almost like a character. And I've heard it said about characters, that representation is not appropriation. And so for me, depicting a character whose life experience is vastly different from mine, or just different from mine, is not necessarily appropriating their culture or their background. As long as I'm giving them an inner life, as long as I'm not reaching for stereotypes, which I would call the low hanging fruit, um, and which I would also call lazier writing. Like, let's take the time to discover an inner life for that character, and again, an inner life for that language. And we can return to the ideas I mentioned earlier by Michael Shurtleff, that whatever is true, let's bring the opposite in. So if a language sounds harsh to our ears, let's talk about the moment when that language sounds tenderest and softest to our ears. Um, and so again, in order to see what passes muster, I want to make sure I'm sharing that piece that talks about that language or uses that language with people who speak that language, and in this case, who can act as better representatives than I can. And then in the writing itself, I feel sometimes this question answers itself. Sometimes it just happens in the writing, but to be able to identify um, what the narrative voice is. If, as a writer, I feel that I'm being a teacher and helping someone unfamiliar with the culture come into the culture. If I'm serving as a tour guide and aiming to entertain with the language. And entertaining is a huge part of literature, right? Because we want to both teach and entertain. But the question is how much do we want to lead with that motive? How much do we want that to be on the surface for the reader? Um, More exciting ideas is maybe I want to be a bully and use my knowledge of the language to bully my reader into feeling like they're missing out, or that something is wrong with them. I think if done insensitively, that could go very, very badly. But if done cleverly, I think that's a great way to entice a reader into wanting to read. And it's also a great way to punch upwards to upend power dynamics about which language is important and what's worth knowing. There's also a way of writing in which you could take the tone of assuming that the reader already speaks this language and saying, yeah, already, like including them in the conversation. I think all of these are really fun possibilities. Um, and I think sometimes going a little faster or assuming a little bit more knowledge than the reader actually has, erring on that side, tends to be more exciting than spoon feeding it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the writing prompt for this week. I'm going to do one last screen share. Here we go. And so here's the writing prompt for familiar languages for this week. In no more than 400 words, write a true story using a mix of English and another language in which you feel confident and familiar. Begin the story by using mostly English and end the story by leaning more on the other language. Think about how you can plant vocabulary at the beginning of the piece that will prepare your reader to understand the end. The reason I feel that this prompt could be helpful is because part of writing with multiple languages is teaching the reader how to understand that second language. And so I really encourage writers to start from a point of commonality with the reader or not, or to do the total opposite, right? I feel follow your instincts. Everything I say is also not true, has that. But the idea is to gradually introduce vocabulary so that we're not loading on sentences and sentences in another language and the reader feels too intimidated to keep reading and they stop. I think that some of the greatest fun in learning a language is picking up a new word and then applying it. And so in the first sentence of my piece, I say, oh, hey, one of my favorite words in Spanish is azafata, which means flight attendant. And explain how its roots are in Arabic and that you can tell that from the presence of the Z and the F, which tends to be in Spanish words that are derived from Arabic. And then go on to tell a long story about a flight attendant I met. And again, this is all fiction. And then at the end of the story, if I dropped in the word azafata without prompting what it meant or translating it, and the reader has this chance to take the information that they have learned and plug it in, I think that leads to a sense of accomplishment and achievement. And so the idea with this story is to sort of start guiding your reader through picking up your language or through picking up empathy for your point of view, for your worldview. So that is this week's assignment. And I'm very excited to see what people come up with. As always, feel free to email me with anything you write. My email is Samantha Steiner at alumni.brown.edu. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Steiner Reads. Feel free to send me a direct message if that feels more comfortable. Or if you feel like just writing and keeping that for yourself, that's wonderful too. Okay. I hope everyone had fun. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. And if anyone has questions or would just like to chat, feel free to reach out and take care. Bye.